Does anyone actually support Canada's online harms bill? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. If you're currently unaware, the online harms bill is the current government's attempt to gain more control over the internet. Now, they say it's for a good reason. It's being positioned as a way to create a safer space online. But, as we'll talk about shortly, a lot of people are seeing through that and realizing it can be quite harmful to even give them that power. First, here's some more background. This comes straight from the Government of Canada's website. They say online platforms are increasingly central to participation in democratic, cultural, and public life. However, some platforms can also be used to threaten and intimidate Canadians and to promote views that target communities, put people's safety at risk, and undermine Canada's social cohesion or democracy. The Government of Canada is committed to putting in place a transparent and accountable regulatory framework for online safety in Canada. Now, more than ever, online services must be held responsible for addressing harmful content on their platforms and creating a safe online space that promotes all Canadians. Now, I'll give it to them. That sounds appealing, at first glance at least, but when you dig into the details, it becomes a bit more hazy. What do they mean by harm? And who is defining this? What about the responsibility of the government not to be mingling so deeply in the lives of their citizens? What about the risk that's posed by giving the government the ultimate say as to what is and is not appropriate online? Other Canadian stakeholders began to think about this, and we have some information. This week, the Globe and Mail reported that newly released documents reveal Twitter Canada, the Canadian arm of Twitter, told government officials that a federal plan to create a new internet regulator with the power to block specific websites is comparable to drastic actions used in authoritarian states like China, North Korea, and Iran. Of course, and that's just the first party that gave their opinion that we'll be talking about, but that's exactly true. Canada would be moving in that direction. And those countries, the similarity there is that they're authoritarian states and they love having the ability to tell you what is and is not harmful. Go back to the statement that I read to you that the Government of Canada put out. They say, for example, they want to get rid of things that undermine Canada's social cohesion. Well, to you that might sound interesting. When you think about this term, perhaps you're thinking about people who are rioting in the streets, destroying infrastructure, but this is at the disposal, the definition, of the authority figures. In a country like North Korea, undermining social cohesion means something very different. And it could mean something very different too in Canada as well, if the authorities wanted it to. In North Korea, if I were to say that Kim Jong-un is a dummy, if I were to say that he's actually not in fact a god, if I were to say that he is driving that country down into the ground, I would be put into jail or executed. Why? Because the country, the state, gets to define harm arbitrarily. And the same goes for countries like China and Iran. Now, what they will take offense against differs. In China, it's not so much as viewing their leader as a deity, but more so about social control. If you have any questions about what the government's putting forward, then you'll be put on a radar and face consequences as a result. You can view the recent example of China's draconian COVID-0 policy and what's happening to people who are trying to refuse that as an example there. Now, this confidential letter from Twitter condemning the bill is among more than 1,000 pages of submissions to an online consultation that the Liberal government launched in July in order to gather opinions on its draft plan for curbing hate speech and other online harms. The document shows the wide-ranging blowback that Trudeau and the government received. And here's a quote from Twitter, another one I want to talk about before we move on. They say that people from around the world have been blocked from accessing Twitter and other services in a similar manner as the one proposed by the Canadian government. Under the false guise of quote-unquote online safety, as we just talked about, it can mean whatever the government wants it to mean. And what this does is it impedes people's ability and their right to access information online freely. The letter then goes on to say that the Canadian government's proposed plan sacrifices freedom of expression to the creation of a government-run system of surveillance. I think that's true, and I think it's a bad thing. Now, moving on. Another private letter, this time from the National Council of Canadian Muslims, warns that the government's plan could inadvertently result in one of the most significant assaults on marginalized and racialized communities in years. It's not too hard to see how this could happen when you look at some of the examples that Canada is being compared to, shamefully. Take Iran, for example. What's a minority group in Iran? You could say atheists. Now, if you were an atheist and you were professing your beliefs publicly, the government would say that this is harmful. They would put it under blasphemy laws, and you could be executed. But at the very least, you will face consequences, and you will be silenced. What about pro-democracy supporters in mainland China? You could expect a very similar government reaction, a complete crackdown on that type of thinking. See, what freedom of expression and free speech do is allow citizens within a country to freely engage in ideas and opinions, even if those in authority positions don't like them or they don't agree with them. They don't have a way to shut you down. But the more you encroach into that free speech, free expression territory, the less safe you make it to go against the grain. This, of course, doesn't mean that it's always a good idea to go against the grain. There's a lot of silliness that we're seeing in groups like the conspiracy theory segment of the population, but we have to just accept the fact that sometimes those in power are wrong. And the best way for us to figure out what's right and what isn't is to freely discuss things, to come forth with ideas, and not to be afraid for our own safety if we discover something that someone at the top doesn't like. And here I think it's worth talking about too the spirit of free speech and the law of free speech. In countries like America and Canada, there are certain guarantees made to you on behalf of the government. Free speech, free expression, the government will not act in ways to undermine that. Even though lately we may have seen some encroachments, these are things that are enshrined. Now, that's different from a culture of free speech. This is at the citizen level. Even if there are no laws that protect an individual from being canceled via saying something that their peer group didn't like, we have to talk about what we value as a society and if that's actually helpful or not. Free speech is something that goes beyond just a statement in a code written by the government. It's a way of living and a way of interpreting other people and understanding what they should and should not be able to say. There are certain things we can all agree that individuals should not be able to say, and those have already been enshrined in law, such as threats, slander, lying in court. But when it comes to ideas, being offended cannot be the bar that we use. An online harms bill that uses that as its basis is incoherent. Just like how a government can warp something like public safety and social cohesion to mean whatever they want and to suit their agenda, individuals can warp things like harm and hate speech to suit whatever they want as well. To be offended is such a subjective term that it can apply to anything, and someone is going to have it applying to whatever you put out. We can't be operating at that level of sensitivity. We must be able to distinguish true hatred from simple ideas and discussions of them. This is something that we failed at entirely as the West continues to descend into illiberal democracies. Now, to pull us back from that tangent, the federal government released a report in February summarizing the feedback that they received based on that consultation for the online harms bill. And they even say the report found that the responses were largely negative. The vast majority of organizations, citizens, companies were telling Trudeau to wake up, that he was sleepwalking down the path of authoritarianism, and that he had no business interfering with the internet in the ways he was proposing. So now, to that question that was posed initially, does anyone actually support this online harms bill? Well, there is some support. And drumroll, who is it? The documents show the plan received generally positive feedback from TikTok. So, if that's who Trudeau is getting his cues from to keep going, we're definitely in an interesting place. Now, to be fair though, there are some things in the online harms bill that make sense and we do actually have to do more on. So it wasn't a complete crapshoot, even though for the most part it was. It wasn't all just sensitivity arguments based around hate speech online. The proposed legislation was meant to combat a variety of threats. So they have here hate speech, as we talked about, terrorist content, content that incites violence. So inciting violence, I'm fully for curbing that. There's no place for violence in a civilized society. And there are two modes of dealing with disagreement, debate or violence, and I'm all for the debate side of things. So let's do what we can to incentivize that and to shut down calls for violence. We don't want to have much of that. And the same goes for terroristic content. Now, the next one is child abuse images online, and this is a major thing that has to be corrected for. It's a widespread problem, and we do need task forces to tackle it. Groups like the RCMP are not staffed or properly equipped to monitor for and to carry out investigations and whatnot to take control of the matter. Whether it's on the dark net or even the surface layer of the internet, these things have become more readily available. And it's quite a problem because the supply comes directly from abusing children. A terrible situation. This I will put more at the top of the list of urgent items that the government should be looking into. Then there's the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. Of course, again, another problem. Typically this occurs when a couple breaks up and one of them wants to be vindictive and they start releasing those intimate pictures. Not good, and something that I agree should be tackled. The bottom line here is that not all of these items are equal. They're all stuffed into one bill, but it's strange because these things are very different by nature and will require a different approach and a different solution. So while Trudeau is getting this bill blasted because he's focusing on censorship and implying government control over means of communications, like on social media and blogs and whatnot, he should just be focusing on tackling criminals, people who are partaking in child abuse scandals and whatnot. He'd have much more support if he focused on these truly heinous things that happen online. We do not need the government telling us what we can and cannot tweet. We do not need them defining for us what is harmful and what is not harmful to say, but we could use their help on cracking down on things that are criminal by nature, that the average individual wouldn't have the power to stop. There are just some problems that debating isn't enough to produce a solution for. Going back again to the child abuse items that pop up on the internet, you can debate about this till the end of the earth, but people will still be partaking, so we need a more forceful hand to get it under control. That's where the government comes into play. Not when people are just simply chatting on Twitter. Now, finally, let's talk about next steps. The government has come forward and said they're going to review all the feedback and they're probably going to slow things down a little bit, which is a win. That's a good thing. Your voice matters. Use it. Tell the government when they're acting stupid and make sure they hear you. Now, how would I like to see things repositioned? As we just talked about, focus the online harms bill on actual harms, on things that we can all agree on, and let's get them help. What's happened here is there are serious problems like the child abuses that I keep mentioning, and things that are more questionable, like saying mean things on Twitter basically. When you bundle these things together, you end up sacrificing progress on the real issues because the debatable ones are mixed into the same batch now. Clear the bill, focus on things that we can all agree on that do need quick and urgent attention, and let's get that going. The government's confusion and fumbling here has been surprising, but I am glad that companies, citizens, and groups have been able to call out the silliness for what it was. And the final note I'll make here is I'm not trying to make the case that Trudeau is trying to make Canada into North Korea, but he might be sleepwalking there, intentionally, unintentionally, and even if he intended for the best things to come from giving government this type of control, he's not going to be the prime minister forever. To give the government this type of weaponry and to not expect them to use it at some point is foolish. It's naive, because it's only a matter of time until someone that you don't like has that same power, and they may use it against you. So it's better to decentralize these things and bring back the regulatory efforts down to the citizenry level. But first we do have to talk about things like values, and that's a larger discussion. So with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share to help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.